Does the key of the music you are listening to even matter? Without perfect pitch or some kind of reference, you're not going to know anyway. D major, F sharp major, E flat major, if you can't tell the difference, then who cares? Composers and songwriters could just pick keys at random or use the same key over and over again and most people would never know the difference. Well, yes, it does matter, but probably not for the reason you think it does. In the 18th century, organist and composer Christian Schubart published a musical treatise titled An Idea Towards the Aesthetic of Music. In this work, he has an entire section that describes the different characteristics of all the possible keys. For example, he describes the key of C major as pure, innocent, simple, and reminded him of baby talk. He describes A flat major as the grave key, reminding him of death and decay. And he describes G minor as displeasure and uneasiness, as if worried about a failed scheme. I'll include a link to this in the description so you can check out the rest of his descriptions. To Schubart, there was a clear delineation between all of the keys, and each of them were appropriate in different musical situations. And if we look throughout history, we get other composers and theorists trying to do the same thing. Marc-Antoine Charpentier from 1682 describes the key of C as warlike, the key of G minor as serious and magnificent, and B flat minor as obscure and terrible. In his description, several keys, including A flat major, F sharp major, and C sharp major, are left out entirely, and this gives us a clue as to why composers describe these keys as so unique. Before the 19th century, musical tuning was not standardized, as it is today. There were many different tuning systems that existed throughout history, and these systems are what led to these keys being unique. Meantone tuning was widely used before the time of Bach, and this tuning would produce different interval sets depending on what key you were in. The further you got away from the key of C, the more distorted intervals would become, and this was done to various degrees. But what this meant is that each key would actually have its own unique sound because they would all have their own unique tuning of intervals, meaning that each key would actually sound a little different. If you spent your whole life listening and playing within this system, you would likely be able to identify each key just from the sound of it, and you would be able to use these different sounding keys to convey different emotions. However, because of the distortion of intervals, certain keys became completely unusable because they were so out of tune, which is why they were left out of Charpentier's treatise. For example, listen to the difference between C major and F sharp major in Meantone Temperament. F sharp is hard to listen to. As tuning systems continued to develop, keys became more similar, such as with well-tempered tuning, the system that Bach used in his well-tempered clavier. And this meant that all keys were accessible, but there were still audible differences between them, which is why in Schubert's treatise, all keys are included, but they were still described as unique. But in the 19th century, Western music moved to equal temperament, which is the system that is still used today. Other cultures still use other tuning systems, but for Western music, it's almost all in equal temperament. Equal temperament is a system that keeps the octave perfectly in tune and then divides all of the half steps between the octave into 12 equal parts. And this means that every interval, except for the octave, is slightly out of tune, but every half step is exactly the same size. And since all of our intervals are measured in terms of half steps, this means every interval will be exactly the same no matter what key you are playing in. Which then means that every key sounds exactly the same, as all of its intervals are tuned exactly the same way. So now any composer could play anything in any key and it will sound good. No weird intervals and no huge tuning issues. The entire circle of fifths was now accessible at any time. But of course this means that every key also lost its unique characteristics. So that means since we started using equal temperament, key doesn't matter, right? They're all exactly the same. Well, that would probably be true if everything was performed on electronic instruments, but luckily a large chunk of us are still using physical ones. The differences between keys now has more to do with the instruments that interpret them and less to do with the keys themselves. And these differences come in the forms of timbre and practicality. Timbre refers to the character or quality of a musical sound independent from its pitch. For example, if you play a G on the guitar and the same G on an upright bass, the two sounds will sound different even though the pitch is exactly the same. And practicality refers to what is more or less difficult or possible versus impossible to execute on a particular instrument. For example, on the bass, I can play a G major arpeggio that extends past the end of the fingerboard with harmonics, but the same thing would be impossible in the key of F sharp. The most practical way to explain this is through the voice. It's an instrument that we are all familiar with. All of us have a range in our voices that we sound best in. Everyone has been through the experience of trying to sing along to a song on the radio and having to strain to hit those high notes, which causes your voice to sound raspy and more than likely out of tune. But if you were to take that same song and transpose it to a more comfortable key, it would sound better, plain and simple. You wouldn't have to strain to hit those high notes, it would be more in tune, and the key would make a huge difference in your performance, both to you and to your audience. And the same thing is true for every instrument out there. Ever wonder wonder why most violin concertos are in the key of D, it's not because someone decided that D major sounds the most concerto-iest of all keys. It's because 1, it's very practical for the violin to play in the key of D, and 2, the key of D sounds very good on the violin because of the way the open strings lay. The tonic, dominant, and subdominant of that key all ring out well, creating a more resonant sound. Bach's second suite in D minor,
the saddest of all keys,
sounds very resonant on the cello and the bass in that key, but take that same music and play it in D flat minor, and it becomes exponentially more difficult to execute, and the instrument won't sound as good. And there are more examples of this for every instrument. Difficult piano pieces are often in the key of black keys because it's practical to do virtuosic runs on the black keys. Jazz music is often in B flat, E flat because the trumpets and the saxes are tuned to those keys, which make them friendly to play in. Strings prefer sharp keys because of the resonance of the open strings, and winds prefer flat keys because they are more practical on their instruments. You get the idea. The key of the music matters, but not because of the key itself, but because of the practicality and the sound that the instruments make that interpret the music. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and check out my Patreon.